This is a Geek Leader podcast, and I'm your host, John Rauda. This show is all about helping us grow as leaders, become better technologists, and improve our lives both at work and at home. I hope you enjoy the show and learn a lot. Hello, and welcome to episode 186 of a Geek Leader podcast. I did change the music around, but that's okay. I hope you guys like it. I hope it's an improvement because we're always trying to improve on this show. I'm your host, John Rauda, and today's sponsor is Private Internet Access. You can find out more about Private Internet Access by going to geekleader.com/VPN. So what do I talk about Private Internet Access? Well, Private Internet Access has a service of global VPNs that allow you to connect many different devices to their VPN, which will mask where you're coming from on the internet. So why do you say you want to do that? I'm not a criminal. I don't want to do that. But it adds a layer of protection. So if you are traveling and you want to connect somewhere, you're at the mercy of the Wi-Fi of wherever you're located. If you're going to connect, maybe you're on vacation or you're traveling for holidays, you're in a family's house, you can protect where you're coming from by using Private Internet Access. You can also test out the internet from different places. So many of us have jobs where we're building websites, we're developing software, or we want to test out bandwidth of what it's like to connect from, let's say, California or from the UK or from Brazil. You can do all that with Private Internet Access, and you can get a discount today by going to geekleader.com/VPN. All right, Geek Leaders, today on the show, I've got Bill Coletti. And he is an experienced C-suite and global crisis and reputation management strategist, and the author of a book that I've got sitting in front of me called Critical Moments. He's also the founder of Kith. And Bill, welcome to the show.
Hey, John, it's super to be here. I'm looking forward to a great conversation.
If you don't mind, just tell the audience a little bit about kind of how you got to where you are, what your career and your background has been like, so that we can have some context for this episode and things we talk about.
Yeah, sounds great. So I started running political campaigns. Was a political science major in college, and my first campaign worked on a state senate campaign as a senior in high school, and that sent me on a journey of running campaigns and ran progressively larger races all the way from when I finished college until around 2000, excuse me, 1995. Then I went to Bulgaria, moved to Eastern Europe for 5 years, and there was taking the skill sets of politics and in a newly emerging democracy and working with the prime minister and the Ministry of Labor and different folks. And we privatized their pension system and also worked with them on creating a stock market that didn't really previously exist. And then came home in 2000 and ran a political campaign again. And then I've been doing some form of this since about 2001, crisis communications, reputation management, big firm PR. And then 6 years ago, founded my own firm, Kith, and wanted to try to find a new way to figure out how to do crisis and reputation management for companies. So been doing what I'm doing here for about 6 years now.
Awesome. And some of the companies that I know you've kind of worked with in the past have gone through different types of crisis. And people would say right now, COVID and things that are going on through it is kind of a big crisis. But I would imagine that's a little bit different than maybe like a cybersecurity crisis or something along those realms.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we have done some of that work, but both Home Depot, Target, way back in the day, 2014, seems like forever ago, kind of the first big ones that we had, but then various, large, medium, small data breaches, releases of PII, really just sort of managing the communications around these issues around data, but also for a lot of big companies doing training and simulation, helping organizations prepare and get sort of refine their response. And over that time, we've kind of learned some systems and some processes of how organizations need to respond when those things happen.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that, if you're in a small or medium-sized company, you may not have any preparation. You may not be prepared at all. And I know I was a part of, some type of cyber attack not too long ago. And luckily for us, we didn't have any data breach, no PII getting out, but it was more of an internal ransomware type scenario. And just knowing how to communicate internally is one of those things that I think that a lot of leaders, especially on the technology side, don't have. They haven't been trained on how should we, craft messages out, especially when, let's say, your email server's down. How do you go about that?
Yeah, critical stuff to figure out, to do it the right way to meet the expectations of your internal audience, which is critical. And that's what you guys, it sounds like you kind of learned that firsthand.
Yeah, I definitely went through that process. But how is the message different when you're talking about communicating internally versus externally?
Yeah, so you can probably at its simplest form, you can probably use a little bit more code or a little bit more sort of insider lingo. Particularly if you're a technology organization, you have shorthand. There's shorthand of the way you communicate with your
Hmm.
data colleagues versus the way you'd say communicate with me, kind of a layperson. So I think that's one thing. I think two is the consistency and always being communicating, sharing often. I think your internal teams, you need to really be conscious of sharing with them. Here's what we're doing. Here's how we're fixing it. Here's how we're going to get back to normal. I don't know if the public needs all that as much detail, that detailed step by step process that you'd have to do internally. The other thing is, and similar to external, is what does it mean for me? What's the implications of this on me? And that doesn't really matter who you are, internal or external. So,
Hmm.
I think at its simplest form, you can probably use shorthand. I think consistency, letting everybody know that we're on top of it, are pretty universal and but pretty unique to the internal audiences.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. What what is the importance of like so going back to Target, and that's one example that we all are, are aware of. Whenever a big company gets hit like that, their reputation is going to take a hit. Is that part of the reason why you put together this book about reputation management and going through those critical times?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the book, Critical Moments, it was really born, it wasn't born out of a data breach and it wasn't born out of a technology challenge. It was just
Mhm.
born out of a series of crises that we've been involved in. And since, as you know, and you're the expert in this space, data and technology is so pervasive, and even the most old school businesses are still impacted by data at some level, is that the genesis of the book came from a crisis that I had been involved with. Amazing female CEO, incredibly talented woman. And we had gone through this crisis and we were really in the crosshairs of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. And we kind of went through this crucible of a week together, and lots of very difficult things, decisions that they had to make and then they had to execute on. Um, during that whole process, I was talking about this notion of reputation management. And we were in a crisis, and I got a lot of head nods of like, yeah, we just got to get out of the moment, get out of the crisis. And this notion of reputation didn't really resonate. And so the CEO and I were debriefing after the fact, and she recalled back and she said, you've been talking about reputation for a couple of weeks now, about our reputation and this, that, and what do you mean by that? And so
Mhm.
I, being a very earnest consultant, used a bunch of jargon and really very complicated language. And she said, "Man, I think I understand what you mean, but I need a simple model, a simple process that I can deploy and put budget to, and I can deploy and put job descriptions to." And she said something like the 4 P's of marketing. So if you're familiar with the four
Yep.
P's, it's price, product, place, promotion, basic building block of marketing. And she said, I need something like that. So that night I got on my plane and I flew back home, and on a cocktail napkin or a piece of paper on my table in front of me in a chair, wrote all of this information about what do I mean. And that's where the book idea of the book came from, and the 4 A's of reputation management, that you can actually manage reputation the same way you manage data, the same way you manage IT systems, the same way you manage HR or legal or janitorial services. There's actually a process to manage reputation, just like any other discipline within the organization.
So getting back to one of the things I really liked about the book right away. I'm a huge Seth Godin fan. And I don't really talk about him on the show at all, but I teach a class at Winthrop
Awesome.
University, and in that class, I have like 3 videos that we watched that are about Seth Godin. And you started out chapter 1 with a quote that says, "Reputation is what people expect us to do next. It's their expectation of quality and character of the next thing we produce, say, or do." And I think that is so fantastic, even from a personal standpoint, because our personal reputation as a leader or a manager of a team is really important. And you want to make sure that expectation of what you're going to do next in a crisis, or even not in a crisis, is managed in a way that makes sense. And I think this book really does a good job of that. You mentioned the 4 A's. What are those 4 A's?
Yeah, let me go back to the Seth Godin example, and then I'll
Sure.
unpack the A's. Is that I too very fond of Godin, and I think it's really, even if you're on the operations side of a business, understanding marketing, how things are explained, how things are talked about, are really critical. And so what I take away from that definition is this phraseology that I came up with of next spectations. Is that it's the expectation about what you say or do next. And so as a leader, as an individual, your teams have an expectation of what the next thing you're going to do is, because most good teams are trying to get ahead of their leader. They're trying to predict what's going to happen. And so if you've built a understanding in people's minds about what you're going to do next, that's their expectation. And so take a big company like Walmart or take a company like Starbucks. If either one of those that I mentioned, you have an intuitive understanding, John, of what you expect them to do next. And Walmart's may be negative and Starbucks may be positive in that context. So that notion of next expectations is critical from a corporate standpoint, as well as an individual leader, is that we have to be very, very conscious of that both. I don't do much for individual reputation management. It's really much more about in a corporate context, but you're right on, particularly for your audience that thinks that it's just simply managing the inputs and the outputs. There's a lot more to that from a leadership standpoint.
Yeah, so I remember when I was first getting into management, I was managing a web team. And one of the books I picked up, I was going through all kinds of leadership books and learning different things. And it was a book that I found called, I don't remember who wrote it, but it was something about marketing your information systems team. Yeah. And I was like, why does marketing, and that's what intrigued me, is the fact that marketing, I never related marketing to that, but it talked a lot about, when if you're, let's say, an operations team, an IT department, and most of your customers are internal, right? You're working with marketing and sales and accounting and finance and HR and everybody else. You need to market to those teams and manage your reputation, and not be the group that's considered a cost center and a waste of money and a big expense, but be the group that creates solutions and is always there to help people out. It is, the reputation is to exceed someone's expectations and that kind of thing. And I like your term, next expectations, that you put out there. I think that's really good. I'm sorry to get off subject.
No, I love it, because I think it's really, really critical, and particularly for the folks that listened to your podcast, is that as long as the end product is delivered, the means that we got there doesn't matter. And that's not true. The way you collaborate as a partner, the way you inform your constituencies, the way you pre-explain complex issues that So John, if you and I were working together, you're the subject matter technical expert, I'm the marketer, and I've got to communicate it around it. A distinction for me, and this is true with companies as well, a distinction for me is that you're going to predict in advance my level of confusion about a aspect of the way the website's going to work. And you need to explain that to me as a layperson. And so that I understand that. And that's what makes IT leaders like you, that transcends them from just being, the bits and bytes and zeros and ones, but also to be ultimately a storyteller. Because the reason you have that website, I would assume, is to try to generate sales or create efficiency. And if people don't use it, understand it, and validate it, it's not going to work. It's not going to meet that objective. So it's being able to think about reputation is really, really critical, because you're shaping my perception of you and your department, if you will. Those are being shaped in real time. And that's where the 4 A's really sort of work, both in a corporate context as well as an individual context.
Yeah, I think, when you get into communication, you're talking about, technical folks. I always try to explain things down, try to, I don't want to say dumb it down, but explain it in a way that someone that doesn't understand the technology will understand it. Use metaphors, use stories. And one of the things that, you come out of a college, you've been kind of ingrained in for at least 4 years, sometimes 5 or 6, all these big terms and using hard things to show people how smart you are so that you get good grades. But if you do that in the business standpoint, you're just going to isolate yourself. So you've got to kind of be able to tell a story, show meaning, show that, this technical thing you're working on has an ROI. It has a business aspect that makes sense, that's relatable to folks that aren't in technology.
Do you find that's hard for either people listening to your podcast or just other people that you're coaching and advising? Is that concept, which makes perfect sense to me as a communicator, is that hard for your IT brethren to get their arms around that concept that you just
Yeah,
explained?
yeah, it is. It is. Sometimes it's hard because they say, well, why do they need to understand that? Why?
Yeah, it's black
Why
and
do you
white. It
need to
makes
do
perfect
that?
sense to me.
All they need to know that we have it up. No, you got to explain the process behind it so that there's comprehension of the effort that goes into having it up, right?
Yeah. To
Yeah,
take that insight, perfect insight, just in that little microcosm of deploying data or deploying technology for the betterment of the organization. Those are similar conversations that I'm having about the rationale and the importance of why a good reputation manages, or why a good reputation matters. Because so many organizations say, if we just make our product, sell it at a fair price, and just do what we need to do and just stick to our knitting, we don't have to do anything to grow our reputation. And it is so much more dynamic, and people's expectations are so much different. That doesn't really work anymore. Just simply meeting the mail or delivering the product, it's a lot more complicated. And I think that's what you're explaining, is that there's a lot more that's dependent on that leader, and it's a lot more dependent on a company as they go tell those stories publicly.
Yeah, I mean, you can you mentioned in your book Apple and Amazon as examples of different things, but just take Amazon, and right now they're doing all kinds of ads about how they're changing the the carbon footprint. They're trying to go net zero. I mean, they don't have to spend money on that. That's actually not profitable for them to spend money on that right now. But what it does is it builds their reputation so that it becomes extremely profitable, 10 years from now.
Yeah. And great segue into what the 4As are. You asked me that a while ago, and we kind of both.
Yeah, I kind of forgot about that, didn't I?
Yeah, that's okay. But that's a perfect example. So hold that Amazon, and I'm seeing those ads as well. They're talking a lot about education, carbon footprint. They're talking really a lot of these softer reputational services. They're not talking about the website or AWS or any of those sort of profit centers. They're talking about these two cost centers, you could argue. So the journey that I articulated back to that female CEO in New York is that's where these 4As came from. And the 4As starts with awareness is the foundation, transitions to assessment, moves to authority. And on the model, you'll see there's a solid blue line at the top of authority, and then that moves to action. And so I would argue that either exactly or intuitively, Amazon followed that process, and the blue line is really important between the third and the fourth element, between authority and action. People think that I can buy my way into reputation management by writing a bigger check or doing a better ad. I'm going to write a check to the United Way. I'm going to just do ads about all my philanthropic activities. And that's jumping immediately to action. So that solid blue line that you'll see on the cover of the book is really, really intentional to stop guys like me, consultants, from coming in and saying, here's what you need to do. Unless you are aware, and unless you've self-aware, unless you assess, ask other people around you. And then and thirdly, get permission from your leadership team to actually walk the walk, not just talk the talk, then can you jump to action. I believe that Bezos and that leadership team really believes in the STEM research that they're doing, really believes in reducing that carbon footprint, really believes in teacher training, all the ads that I've seen about Amazon. They didn't get there by just hiring an ad company to say, hey, do an ad for me about all these great things. They got there through this journey of awareness, assessment, authority, and then ultimately action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
Right. And that's the 4As. And back to the personal point that we were talking about earlier, individual leaders need to do that. Okay. And again, the book and the intent of what we do is not around per se personal development, but I've been doing this long enough that a lot of people see personal growth aspect of this is that I need to be self-aware. Who am I? What do I talk about? Who am I as a leader? I need to ask my team. That's assessment, the second step. I need to make sure I've got the permission, and then I can change behavior. If I all of a sudden just start changing behavior without having gone through those initial steps, it really comes off as pretty fake. Just like if Amazon had decided to just pop up some ads and there's no substance behind any of it.
Yeah, I think their ads are really well done in the fact that they show, well, right before their ads really started hitting the mainstream, I started noticing on my news feed that, Amazon had put orders in for, electric vehicles.
Sure.
And, and I mean, I have a Tesla, so I follow a lot of the electric vehicle news. So I
Yeah.
started seeing like on different blog sites that I read that Amazon bought, 1,000 electric trucks. It's like, wow, where are they getting these from? What's going on here? Or
Sure.
Amazon invested in, some auto manufacturer, battery manufacturer, and then the ads start rolling in, and it's like, oh, okay, so now they're, kind of reaffirming some of the steps that they've started to get through, and it's there's substance behind it. It's not just a gimmick.
Yeah. 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 No, it's great. And we talk about reputation management, particularly for corporations. So we talked about data breaches and PII and ransomware and those topics. After those things happen, that's when most people become conscious of reputation. So it takes typically some sort of precipitating event when people go on this reputation management journey. That's not always the case. I can't point to the Amazon crisis per se. They just knew that bolstering their reputation was important. But for the most part, most normal companies, there is sort of this inflection point of a crisis that we work with them on and help them on. But that then leads them on the necessity of this reputation management journey. And that's what the book is really about. But we do both. We work with people in their crisis, but we also work with the company on transforming and changing the organization's reputation over the long term.
So how quickly could someone rebound from a bad reputation right now? Because I've seen companies like Equifax. When
Yep.
when they got hit, it was like, oh, they're out of business. But
Yep.
they're not.
Nope.
Why do you think that is? And is it because they did a really good job, or because maybe our I don't know, culture is changing a little bit?
Or attention span. That could
Oh
be
yeah,
it.
yeah. The news media is so quickly.
Yeah. I think that, with the internet, nothing ever dies. Okay. So if no one's familiar with Equifax and they Google them right now, they'll see about the data breach and understand the challenges that they had. So getting back to normal is a fool's errand. The goal is not to get back to normal. The fool is to get back to strategy, because normal is going to change.
Mhm.
And so that's what's different. And so for Equifax, perfect example, they made some communications errors. They had some obviously data errors and data protection errors. They did a good job of figuring out who really matters most, who are the stakeholders, who are the communities that really matter. And they've done a nice job of speaking directly to them. Some people's instinct, back to the 4A's model, is they just going to jump to action, and we're just going to do a TV or a digital ad campaign about how safe your data is. That doesn't really work. You got to
Right.
go on this sort of more thoughtful journey. So I think they've done a good job. You're right. The initial instinct was, in a competitive marketplace where there's three other data collection agencies like them, credit agencies, is that you'd say, well, the other two will just clean their clock. They did a nice job of not talking to the public, but talking to those that matter most. And I believe they got there from being self-aware, understanding their market, and then doing some assessment to understand who really matters, as opposed to over-indexing for the mainstream, the main public. And so that's why I think they've done actually a nice job.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think they did a pretty nice job as well. And the fact that people are yeah, I don't know. I don't want to say like they're becoming softer when it comes to this kind of things, but it seems like they care less about some of the their own privacy per se, because of convenience. But there is still this like a growing concern about y- social justice, social
Yeah.
that you're protecting the community as a whole seems to be growing, whereas the individual maybe lessening. Are you seeing that as well?
Oh, 100%. And really keen insight. So great observation. I think the notion, and I just know it from me and my family as a consumer, my data protection tolerance has just gotten a little bit higher. I'm more tolerant, and there's websites, and I get emails every now and then that say, you've been subject to a hack or this and that. And, I try to be really conscious about my passwords. I try to be really conscious about my ecosystem and protect stuff, but they're just, we've sadly, there's been so much of it out there is that we've just become tolerant to it, become a little bit immune to that. What we haven't become immune to are those issues that you talk about how is data being used and how is data being deployed. That's a different organization because that impacts populations, and we care about populations. Ironically, we don't care about individuals or our own data as much as we probably should, or an expert like you would probably recommend. But what you're finding, and when you reference social justice and these issues, about how companies use data and is data being used as a force for good, and equality. That's what we call, and we just finished a white paper on this, around social risk. And those are risks that impact populations. Mm-hmm. And that to me is the next big area of reputation management and crisis communications. It's not data. It's not data protection. It's really more about what do we have and what do we use and the implications that it has on populations. That's the new frontier for us. It's not about, do we have good holding statements in place for the next time there's a data breach? So it's not the future.
Could that go into like the, I'm trying to think, relate this to a technical aspect. I've seen lots of cases where even Microsoft mentioned that, we need to really think hard about facial recognition software and how we use it, because it, certain races of folks aren't as, it doesn't pick up as much because most of their sample size that the AI is using is, white males. So it becomes a little bit difficult to hit other genders and other races of folks.
Yep. And so I think that, one of the things that I really get excited about in talking to people like you that are experts in generally speaking, an operational field, mm-hmm. is that for those of us on the communications or the marketing side, is that we need a gearbox. We need a linkage between the operators and the marketing communications folks, because to have a conversation around risk, because I'm sure you and your team and your colleagues and most of the listeners to this podcast are really good at understanding risk and understanding things that can break and understanding things that can go wrong, and then seeking to mitigate those risks at an operational level. But if we can find a common ground, and we've got a framework that we use, but if we can find a common ground with marketers to understand the things that can go wrong that will directly impact the public, that's the linkage, and that's where operations and marketing communications can come together. We think that organizations should think about risk in three, and then a plus one, three different ways. We think there are, and I'm curious if this resonates with you and from your project management and technology leadership vantage point, is we think there's one risk that's called strategic risks you intended to do for superior economic benefit. We did this for a reason, right, or efficiency reasons. 2, preventable risks, things you should have zero tolerance for, things that simply shouldn't happen. The simple example is that if you and I were making hamburger patties, there should not be metal shavings in the hamburger patties. There should be zero tolerance for that. And then there's 3rd, external risk. That's weather events, things around force majeure, things that typically involve law enforcement, people, active shooter, crazy things like that are external. If communicators and operators can agree that this is the framework that we're going to talk about risk and then begin to mitigate them, that's a really powerful way for teams to get together and talk about risk, as opposed to if you were the CTO of a company and I was the chief marketing officer for the company, and I walked to you and I said, hey, John, just tell me everything you think could go wrong. That's a really foolish conversation for me to say, tell me everything that could go wrong. But if I say strategic, preventable, and external, we've got a framework for a conversation that I can then explain to you the public exposure to these challenges. You can explain to me, if that does get exposed, it is going to be difficult to solve. Here's the challenges there. That to me, that's creating a really, really robust and efficient organization. to talk about public's expectations around strategic, preventable, and external risks. So I'd love to get your reaction to that in thinking about risks and how risk fits into the things that you do in kind of in your day job, if you will.
I definitely see the different categories in that framework behind it, but I do see that some things, move between those categories. Like for example, we may have something that we would say this is a preventable risk, there should be no tolerance for, and then the price goes way up, and we say, okay, we're going to make a strategic decision to forego some of this and make this now
totally
something different.
Yeah, and in the framework, one of the the deeper understanding around preventable is that it's preventable if you have infinite resources, time, money, and manpower, and so there could never ever be, a gun walks into a shopping mall to create a tragedy with a gun, or a school if we had infinite resources and magnetometers at every school and we were willing to give away with civil liberties. So that's your point, is that it's too expensive to do this, and that's when things shift over into a strategic risk. But you consciously made that decision. You weren't surprised by it.
Yeah. So like what I was thinking there, like the example would be, you would think that an operating system update, upgrading your operating system to the latest Microsoft patches or whatever, should never take down a system, because you should test those updates on like systems and so on and so forth. But as your company grows, you get more and more software packages, more and more variants of users. And let's say you've got 1,200 employees now, it's very likely that some combination of hardware, software that are on those machines could be broken by that update. And you can't test them all because you can't have a duplicate of every individual's user and spend the time to go through that process, every Tuesday.
Right. But and then where it becomes, so let's extrapolate that out. If it becomes sort of a public facing problem, I mean, what you're talking about may or may not
it's internal.
reach the public per se, but for the sake of this argument, assume that it does reach to the public. You and your leadership team made a strategic decision not to completely stand up, and help me on the technology here, completely stand up a shadow operation so that you could belt and suspender and make sure that there was going to be no failings. You were willing to take a risk because of the economics. It just really wasn't worth that. And so you made a decision not to do something that you knew that you could do, but because of cost or time or what have you. If it does break, I'm going to come ask you as a communicator, and then and then we're worried about what the public's concern is going to be. I'm going to ask you, John, why didn't we do that? And you're going to say, because it was incredibly expensive, it would have taken too long. We don't need to do it. We usually get 95, 98% success on that. That's why communicators and guys like you, we have to be linked so that we can go explain it to the public if it comes to that ultimately. And that's the linkage between communications and operations. And technology is a perfect platform to talk about it. So yes, that's a strategic risk. We decided not to invest this money. Granted, it could have been preventable with infinite resources, but nobody lives in the world of infinite resources. So we make those decisions. That changes how I communicate it and how I tell it to the public.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely get that. And, it's easy. It's an easy story to tell, from that example that we gave you. We can just say, well, cost, right? We're accountable to our shareholders. And if we did that, we would not be profitable.
Sure. Unless for a healthcare company and our software was running some critical service and it didn't work and my mom didn't get her treatment, your cost example doesn't really mean much to me. My mom didn't get her treatment because you guys decided not to do a patch. And so I may be stretching the analogy a little bit too far, but that's where strategic decisions have real life implications on people. And when we have to talk about that as a team in advance.
Yeah, I would say you're not stretching it very far. It's just recent. I was reading an article probably like 2 or 3 weeks ago that a hospital got hit with ransomware because they didn't have the latest patches on their systems, and people died.
Right. And I'm sure the person in your role for that hospital was saying, hey, we got to go do this. We're going to have to invest in this. And somebody else said, no, it'll be okay. That's the linkage. And so if there's something that I want to share with your audience, which are not the people I spend most of my time with, It's that there needs to be this bridged gap between experts like you and experts like me to actually think about these things to grow reputation for companies.
So how do you go about growing your reputation before something like this happens?
Yeah, terrific question. Well, first of all, I think it's necessary to do two things. One, talk about risk the way I'm talking about it. Talk about strategic, preventable, and external for operators and marketers to come together to be able to talk about it in that framework. The second thing is simply readiness. How do we get ready? How do we get ready for a crisis? If one of these things were to happen, how do we prepare ourselves? I believe there's a basic equation in crisis communications. The key differentiator and the key way to protect your crisis is speed in the marketplace. The ability to get messages explaining or defending what's happening into the marketplace. The way you get fast, and this is the equation, it's mission and values plus chain of command equals speed. So if you want to be fast, you got to figure out mission and values and chain of command. So the first building block, if you're going to grow your reputation, is one, talk about the risk and understand the things that can blow you up. I think strategic, preventable, and external is the foundation for that. And then two, make sure your readiness is in place. Make sure that if there's a data breach or if there is this release of PII or ransomware, that our mission and values, that we've talked about them in advance. Then chain of command, who's involved, who gets to make a decision, who gets to be at the seat of the table, that gives speed. With that, you've now created a reputationally resilient organization. The final step is that with those risks that you've identified, and you've identified gaps, you've identified areas where you know that there are things that could go wrong, you begin to mitigate those. And those are very detail and technical oriented. But if you go through that process and mitigate your risk, ultimately, that's how you grow your reputation with organizations that matter. But it starts with an understanding around risk and an understanding around readiness.
How deep into the company should this go? Should this just be at the top level, like the executives, or should this go all the way down to where, the social media managers that are posting things are aware of this?
Well, critically, they should. Now, I don't know if you've got a coding farm somewhere offshore, how deep they need to be aware of this, but your social media manager, absolutely. They need to be conscious of this stuff and understand those reputational impacts. I think it is an incredibly prudent leader, even an IT leader that don't typically get graded on these things, to be conscious of the actions and implications of what we do, that the impact that that's going to have on our company. Absolutely, they should be doing it. I don't think everybody in the organization needs to be on their toes about reputation. It's generally a C-suite conversation, but someone got their keys on Twitter, they should probably be tuned in on these topics.
Yeah, I know, like for me, even on internal crisis management and things like that, I've got emails that I have saved on, for sending out certain notices. So like if we do have an internet outage, I can go and pull up this email, copy, paste it, and be ready to go. And don't have to, especially not in the heat of the moment, a stressful situation, trying to craft something that makes sense, that's, grammatically correct and spell checked and all that good stuff. I have it already pre-canned, ready to go. All I got to do is maybe plug in a couple of variables and hit send.
And I think that all fits into that readiness paradigm. We think there's a whole framework around being ready when these things happen. And so that along with because that readiness, those emails were directly related to risks that you observed. And so that's why you decided to keep them. You said, hey, this is a risk. I need to be ready. So I'm going to keep this template or boilerplate language ready for the next time.
Yeah, exactly. Just in case it happens again, I'm ready.
Yep, absolutely.
So what are some things that maybe we as IT leaders need to be doing to make sure that our department's reputation is upheld in the event of a crisis, or even not, even in the event of just day-to-day life, that we should be doing to make sure that we're ready and we are, we have that good net expectation that you're talking about?
Yeah, great. So simplest advice that I give to people to think about is pull out your favorite trade publication, or the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, or whatever the archive of information in your industry. Pull that out and said, what if this had happened to us? How would we respond? I think that is a simple management level tactic that companies can do to really get this right and to really begin to grow their reputation and think about how they would react, how they would then ultimately mitigate that risk if it were to happen. And so it's not complicated. You don't need to do a huge crisis simulation. You don't need to write a lot of templates or what have you. I just think simply checking in and said, if this had happened to us, how would we respond? And are we prepared for that? So I think that's a simple thing that organizations can do.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. So how can people find out more about you, Bill, and how can they pick up a copy of your book and learn more about the things that you've been working on?
Well, that's great. So our website is kith.co. And so the website's a great resource, great to find us. I'm real active on LinkedIn, try to produce a lot of content and share different ideas there. So those are two great places to find out. You can download a copy of the first chapter of the book off the website. It's available on Amazon and all the other typical places you buy books. And so it's a great intro into the thinking around reputation management and sort of this new mindset of how to think about it. It was intended for corporate audiences, but we've really learned over the past year or so that there's real implications for individuals and real implications for leaders. We wrote it for companies, but so there's a lot of thought process that goes in there. So kith.co is the main website. The ability to find us on LinkedIn. And we're also, John, we're going to stand up a page just for your listeners at kith.co / your podcast so that people can sort of find it and sort of reference backs, and we'll be able to put that in your show notes.
All right. Yeah, I'll link that up so people can find that at geekleader.com. And I definitely recommend checking out this book for sure, even if you're not in a leadership role yet, because it's a great tool to have in your back pocket to understand reputation, because you do have personal reputation that is important, and that of your team. If you're managing a small team, that reputation is also important, not just to your success as a leader, but also your teammate member's success. So definitely check that out. And Bill, thank you so much for coming on the show. Really appreciate it. We'll link up your LinkedIn, the website, and your Twitter and all that good stuff in the show notes as well. People can find that at geekleader.com.
Great, John. Thank you very much. And thanks for doing what you do. It's great stuff.
If you enjoyed that episode, please leave a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. I'd greatly appreciate that. And also don't forget to check out merch. We have some t-shirts that I've designed that are on at geekleader.com. You can click on the merchandise section there and check that out. And also don't forget about the books from our guests. So if you like this guest and other guests that have written books, please go ahead and check that out at geekleader.com. I would greatly appreciate it, and I'm sure they would too.